Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this special edition of Macro Pro and Friends. Why is this a special edition, you ask? Because it's our first one that focuses on Arizona claims. For those of you who don't know me, I am Diane Cohen, and I'm the Vice President of Client Relations and the Educational Department here at Macro Pro. Macro Pro is a document retrieval company. We can get records for you, regardless of where they are. So if you need anything for your claims file, please let us know. Whether it's just a regular claim or litigated claim, we can get those records for you. All right, I have a little bit of housekeeping that I'd like to take care of. So first of all, for those of you who are looking for CEU credits, we will have those emailed to you tomorrow. There will be a little blue button. So when you see that blue button on the email, make sure that you click it and download your certificate. Your email will say your certificate has arrived. So you'll know that it is there in that email. In addition to that, if you have any questions for our experts today, please make sure that you ask those questions in the comment box, and we will be happy to ask those questions of our experts. And then lastly, we will have an encore performance on the Macro Pro YouTube page. So if you'd like to see this presentation again, we will have it available to you Friday at the Macro Pro YouTube channel. All right, today I am joined by Mandy Farquhar. Hi, Mandy, how are you?
Good, I'm doing well.
Good. Well, Mandy has been very busy organizing this event. So Mandy, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, it was my pleasure to organize this event with our Macro Pro friends. First, I want to introduce our friend Jennifer Carrington at Central Com. She's going to talk a little bit about her company.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Carrington, and I am the Vice President of Client Services for Central Com. We are a nationwide ancillary service that specializes in durable medical equipment, home health, physical therapy, orthotics, prosthetics, diagnostics, catastrophic care, specializing in hearing aids, also transportation and bill review services. We are very efficient in the discharges on a Friday at 4 o'clock. So give us a call for your discharges. And we are so excited to be here and involved in the CEU. Thank you. And I will turn it back over to Mandy.
Thank you, Jennifer. And again, as you know, I'm me.
Mandy, I'm so sorry. I forgot to say one thing. Attached to this webinar is the handout materials and some other materials on our sponsor. So this would be the time for you to download that information so that you could follow along and have that. The information will be available to you until the end of the seminar. Okay, Mandy, thank you so much, and I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to let everyone know I'm Mandy Farquhar, the National Account Executive with Macro Pro. Macro Pro has been in business for 33 years, and we are nationwide and even worldwide. Today, I'm going to introduce our friends at ISO Claims Partners. We have a great session on getting your claims settled in Arizona. Can't wait to see you all soon, hopefully real soon. Here is Cici Marazuica and Nicole Bonaventura. They're going to introduce their speakers. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mandy, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Nicole. I am the Account Executive at ISO Claims Partners. And here at ISO Claims Partners, we are your Medicare compliance advocates. So we ensure Medicare compliance and mitigate risk throughout the life of the claim. We have an entire panel of Medicare experts, and one of our finest experts that we have the pleasure of working with is Sid Wong. And Sid will be hosting today's, or co-hosting rather, today's session. Sid is our AVP of policy, and he is a fantastic resource. Sid keeps our team and our partners abreast of the ever-changing CMS policies, and he translates those updates into action. Sid ensures that our policies and our programs are aligned with CMS, and he works with our partners to develop a tailored compliance program to our partners' needs. We're all in for a treat hearing from Sid today. Thank you, Sid. And I'll pass it over to my counterpart, Cici. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Nicole. As Nicole stated there, and as your ISO Claims Partners local representative, account manager. I'm very excited for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful MacroPro event today. And I definitely look forward to meeting everyone in person very soon there in the Arizona market and all around us as we all been at home. Just so you guys know, ISO Claims Partners is a division of Verisk Analytics. And we bring to you expertise in MSP compliance and services. And we have tenured attorneys and nurses on every product and services that we bring to you, including our Medicare set-asides and our medical cost projection. In our handouts, there is a service flyer which lists all those different services that we offer, but specifically those two, we'll talk a little bit about, how we geared those towards reducing your claim costs and expediting your settlement. Among the team of experts is one of our speakers today, who I consider one of our best assets and resource in Medicare compliance. Mark Papalucio is our national speaker, nationally recognized thought leader in our space, and he brings prior experience as an insurance defense attorney, combined with his many years of specializing in Medicare secondary payer compliance. Mark has authored numerous articles on Medicare secondary payer issues and is regularly featured as a presenter at national seminars and other industry events like this one today from our MacroPro friends. Diane?
Yes, well, gentlemen, we are looking very forward to your expertise that you're sharing with us. Have a great webinar. We'll see you in about 50 minutes.
Thank you, Diane and Mandy and Jennifer and Cece and Nicole. Sid, I feel like we're outnumbered here. Thank you for the warm welcome and the invite to present here MacroPro webinar series. It's an honor for us to do so. And Sid, if we could, I think we may be missing the agenda slide here on the deck.
Oh, there it is.
Hold on one second.
And here's the screen. Get it?
There it is. Perfect. So today's focus, folks, we're going to try to get claims settled in Arizona, okay? And we're going to concentrate on the Medicare aspect that could impact your claims, which many of you know really could, if you're not on top of things, could put the death knell into your settlement. That's what we want to try to prevent today. Let's break it all down. Let's figure out, spot the issues. Let's understand what it is we need to do. Let's understand what the risks are. Let's understand what the strategies are, right? And that's especially true when we're talking about Arizona, because now you have greater opportunity to settle than you ever did before, right? So let's take advantage of it. Let's address Medicare as part of the settlement. Let's talk about these compliance obligations and issues. Let's talk about the different strategies to stay compliant and get the claim settled. And we'll talk very briefly at the end. Cece did a nice job talking about how it is we can help. Okay, and anything we're talking about today, we can help. So let's just start that straight. Now, look, here's what I was just talking about. You have an unprecedented opportunity now in Arizona to get claims settled where you didn't have this before. Now, in 17 and then 18, when the new law first came out and then they revised it, Sid and I spent a lot of time. We released articles on the new law. I spent a lot of time with Sid creating adjuster handouts and cheat sheets and stuff like that, breaking down the Arizona law. We're not going to do that today. We've done that, okay? But we do want you to recall here on this slide that part of this focus is to determine if your claim could settle underneath Arizona's new full and final settlement law. If it can, then let's talk about getting that case settled. If you have a question about that, we could talk to you offline. You could talk to your defense counsel, etc. But keep this new law in mind, because now you can settle. Let's use it to your advantage to clear these claims off your deck. So, Sid, let's start real quick with a quick Medicare warm-up. And there will be a trend today. Anything hard, I give to Sid. Okay, so he's coming up in a little while to talk about the tricky stuff. Okay, so let's understand right away when we're handling these files, just like when I was in defense practice, I had to look for the red flags in Medicare. did I have a claimant that was on Medicare or could be on Medicare, either maybe now or maybe sometime in the future? And I look for red flags. I look for age, 65 years or older. I look for folks who are on Social Security disability. Those people are going to eventually get Medicare. It's just part of the package, okay? They could be on Social Security disability for something completely unrelated to our workers' comp injury, but once they're on it, they're going to get Medicare, okay? And of course, disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, and end-stage renal disease. So look for your red flag. You know, could we have a potential issue here with Medicare? And if we determine our claimants on Medicare, and this will become more clear as we go along. Now it's very important. 20 years ago when I started this right side of the screen didn't exist because it wasn't an issue. Now it's not only important to know whether your claimant is on Medicare, but if so, what type of Medicare does he or she have? And what do I mean by that? Okay. When a person gets on Medicare, they make an election to the type of Medicare they want, right? Parts A and B are known as traditional Medicare. You see it on the screen, been with us a long time. It's run by the government, okay? And there's one plan in town, whether you're here with me in Miami, Phoenix, Sid up there in Long Island, etc. It's just one plan if they're on the governmental plan. Okay, we're going to learn later that the type of plan has particular impact on lien recovery or recovery claims. But a person who gets on Medicare could say, hey, look, I don't want the government plan. I want one of these new fancy-dancy Medicare Part C or Medicare Advantage plans. Been with us about 20-something years now, but really didn't take off until like last decade. And these are private Medicare plans, not one plan in town, but over 3,500 different plans nationally, okay? And these are provided by private insurance companies. More on these later. And then, of course, if a person wants prescription drugs, no matter which plan they're in, they will choose it through the Part D program, prescription drugs. Not too much on that today. Those folks haven't really woken up yet, okay? But we'll talk a little bit about them later. Okay. Kid will talk a lot about prescription drugs in MSAs because there's huge applicability there. Okay, now, this is how simple Medicare is. Like, if you really understand this slide, when you're handling your files, you're going to know the questions to ask, all right? And look, it's off the rails because the way CMS does it, that's why it gets a little tricky, right? But it's this simple. Look at the slide. So there's 4 major questions you need to ask each other on each file. Ask yourself on each file. Okay, picture 4 different buildings on a campus of Medicare, so to speak. First question is, does the case need to be reported electronically through the 111 system? We're not going to talk about that today. We'll make reference to a couple terms out of there where necessary, but that's the electronic reporting law. That puts your claim on Medicare's radar. The other 3 boxes are the 3 questions we're really going to focus on today. The second question being, do I have a conditional payment lien that I need to deal with? And we're going to learn that this relates to folks who have their Medicare through the government. The government's paid for something, they want to be reimbursed. The next question, do I have a Medicare Advantage lien that I have to worry about? Okay. And then the fourth question actually would be, do I need a Medicare set aside? And if so, what are the things I need to know to keep that as reasonable as possible? So this is it. If you get these 4 questions and ask these 4 questions on every one of your files, you can't miss. You're not going to know everything, and we're not expecting you to know that today. What we want you to do is spot the big issues. You can always call Sid and myself afterwards and walk you through it. But let's learn together. Don't get overwhelmed. Let's take the big picture considerations away. And to start that, I want to set this up right now, because what we want to do first is talk about MSAs. And my 4 boxes I just talked about, we're not going to talk really about 111 today. Thanks, Sid. We're going to start there at the bottom left, Medicare set-aside. And that's where all the action is in terms of where the expense could be and where you need to really understand what it is you could do to lower these. And that's where Sid excels at. Now, let me remind you real quick on the next slide of the Medicare CMS review thresholds in MSA. These are CMS's recommended. They're voluntary. You don't have to do them, okay? But the majority practice still in the industry is to submit an MSA that meets one of these thresholds to CMS for review and approval. Sid will talk later about a growing trend away from this and why, and he's an expert at it, okay? He knows it inside and out, okay? But right now, let's reacquaint ourselves with Medicare's MSA review thresholds, and there's two of them, right? There's two. First, if the claimant's on Medicare and you're settling that workers' comp case for something greater than $25,000, you meet CMS's first review threshold, and they would recommend that you send to them an MSA for review and approval, okay? The second threshold deals with claimants who are not yet on Medicare, but Medicare says, hey, hold on, you're not out of the woods. If you meet both of the prongs I'm about to outline for you, then we would consider you to have met the second threshold, and we would recommend that you submit an MSA to us for review and approval. Look at the right-hand screen. Person's not on Medicare, but our settlement could still meet the second CMS review threshold if two things are true. One, you have that workers' comp settlement greater than $250,000, and, look at the and the person has a reasonable expectation of Medicare enrollment within 30 months. And typically that revolves around whether they're on Social Security, whether they've been awarded Social Security, whether they're challenging an adverse decision, whether they're 62 and a half or older, or have end-stage renal. Okay, so we wanted to set this stage here. So now that we have our minds around MSAs, the next question that Sid's going to handle is, how do we mitigate MSAs so they're not like millions of dollars and we can't get the case settled? Sid.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, one of the things about the ability to close out full and final now in Arizona is this consideration for future medicals and MSA. So we think it's really important as part of that is to consider what your options are to understand how CMS allocates these Medicare set-asides, especially if you're going to be submitting them to CMS for review and approval, and being able to control those costs and still be able to come in with a figure that is amenable to the parties and that the court's comfortable with approving this the full and final settlement for and protects Medicare down the road. So when we look at cost mitigation, the thing that we want to look at first and foremost is what are those cost drivers? What's really causing these the value of the MSA or the value of the future medical treatment to be so much? So that's usually where I take my first step. And just understand that when you're identifying these cost drivers, each case is unique, and you're going to look for specific items, but you can generally, think about specific categories to look for, right? So it's not only the first step, but it's absolutely a key component of cost mitigation. Second of all, when you think about cost mitigation, you also want to think about making sure that the medical records are accurately reflecting what anticipated future medical treatment would look like. The thing with CMS, and one of the things that that they practice, is not wanting to make the call on whether or not something is going to be anticipated or expected or is reasonably going to occur. If they see it recommended, they being Medicare, it sees it being recommended within the medical records, they're going to include it as part of the treatment when they review it. So when you're looking at the medical treatment, when you're looking at the medical records, and when you're thinking about what your medical might look like, you want to really think about two things. Right? First is, are there instances where Medicare or where the medical records are recommending a number of different treatment options, right? So you want to make sure that they're clarified, what's reasonably likely to occur. Physicians are likely to kind of shotgun what they think that might be applicable in a particular situation. So you might have a person that's suffering from a lumbar issue, and the physician might recommend like lumbar epidural steroid injections, as well as surgery if that's not effective, or maybe a spinal cord stimulator. And you don't want Medicare to include all of that within the Medicare set aside. So you want to make sure that whatever's likely to occur is specified in there as a result. Also, if they're not necessarily recommending something, but just talking about it, you probably want to nail down whether or not it's an actual recommendation, because otherwise Medicare is going to try to include that as well. Also, if there's issues where we're not sure if medication that was previously prescribed is still being prescribed, and if it's not, you want to make sure that those medical records indicate that, because otherwise Medicare, again, isn't going to make the call, right? They're going to try to include it if it was previously recommended or previously filled. So you want to obtain these information that supports why treatment is being excluded from an allocation. And typically that's in the form of a treating physician record on the office letterhead, currently dated and signed. Of course, Medicare is also going to rely or defer to court orders if they are considered to be a court order on the merits, where the court has independently reviewed the information that's been provided and makes a determination of whether or not something should be included as a work-related treatment or not. Medicare will typically defer to that, but they're very specific on that. So if you're looking at court orders, you're not going to look at stipulations of the parties. They're going to look at that analysis by the court. And then finally, after you think about the cost drivers, right, and you think about making sure that those medical records are accurate, you also want to think about getting that prescription medication under control. And why is that? It's because medications are one of the primary cost drivers in a Medicare set-aside. So before you kind of step into that arena, you probably want to understand, or at least think about, how Medicare looks at this, so you can approach it tactically, right? You can approach that cost mitigation tactically. So understand that Medicare utilizes in Arizona, as well as across all 50 states, the Red Book average wholesale price. It doesn't matter if a carrier is using a PBM or if there's a different fee schedule involved. Medicare utilizes the Red Book AWP across all 50 states. So when you're looking at the pricing for that, you want to utilize that as a resource. Also, Medicare is going to take a snapshot of what that medication looks like and extrapolate it for life expectancy at the present dosage and frequency, which can be a significant cost driver if you're catching that medication or that treatment at the earlier rather than the latter stages. Right? So you want to make sure that it's the treatment's essentially stabilized, and if there's any cost mitigation that you're thinking about, you want to do it prior to submission. Medicare is going to again liberally look at including medications, so just keep these other things in mind. Medicare will generally not table medications, even if it's indicated within the medical records. They're not going to take into consideration an application of whether or not a brand medication will go generic in the future. And if there's an off-label medication, Medicare has shifted from excluding those from a Medicare set-aside to making sure that the off-label medication doesn't have a usage within what they call the approved compendia. So you just want to make sure if before you exclude something as off-label, that resource is checked as well. So these are a couple of the strategies that we utilize, and we encourage you to utilize and think about when you're thinking about keeping those Medicare set-aside prescription medication costs under control. So I think low-hanging fruit is obviously if a medication is being prescribed as brand and there's a generic available. I've provided an example of that on the screen there. Grayley's is the brand name or brand version of gabapentin, and so is Neurontin. Grayley's is utilized under specific circumstances, even though it's essentially the same medication. It's a slightly different formulation. So just understand that if someone's being prescribed the brand name version, an alternative might be to consider whether or not the physician is willing to prescribe the generic. So that's an example of how to identify the cost driver and apply a cost mitigation with respect to prescription medication. You also want to think about other things that might be able to lower the cost of those prescriptions. Whether or not the expiration of a patent will expire in the near future. If it will, you may think about, I'm sorry, is there a question or? You might want to think about, waiting until that patent expires, because generally speaking, once the generics hit the market, you'll usually see a reduction in cost there. Also, you want to think about high cost medications that might have a combined dosage or formulation, different dosages or a combined formulation. Wixis is an example of that, a very, very expensive medication, over $30 a pill, but really it's combined medication of ibuprofen and famotidine, which is essentially Pepcid. So one strategy that we utilize is to consider whether or not the physician is willing to no longer prescribe Wixis and instead prescribe ibuprofen and famotidine separately, which would result in significant savings in a Medicare set-aside. Even though Medicare doesn't apply tapering or weaning to an MSA that they review, you can consider the timing of the taper. If you're able to wait until the individual is completely off the medication, that might be an opportunity to utilize or to wait until that occurs, and then no longer have to allocate that prescription medication within your set aside. I've already talked about off-label use, making sure that you not only review it but apply it where it is applicable, and then monitoring any types of changes within the pricing for A to AP. Well, at ISO Claims Partners, we utilize a program that we do monitor it monthly, and if we see a reduction in that medication, a significant reduction, we'll see if we can apply that to any prior completed Medicare settlements. And then I talked about this a little bit during the cost driver, or identifying the cost drivers. But in addition to dealing with and cost mitigating the prescriptions, we want to also look at those big ticket items such as surgeries, pain pumps, replacements that require revisions down the road, amputations that might require specific and expensive durable medical equipment. Those are big ticket items that if I look at the medical records, if I see that, I quickly identify that. Yeah, that's going to, like, spinal cord stimulator is going to add at least $30,000, depending on how old the individual is, could be up to $150,000, $160,000 based off the revisions down the road. So just, seeing if that's been mentioned within the records or seeing if it's been implanted already will give me a sense of where some of the costs in the Medicare set aside will be coming from. Additionally, even though you might be looking at high dollar items, don't forget about the items that aren't necessarily expensive, but in the aggregate could be fairly significant in cost down the road. So examples of that would be like physician visits, which are independently maybe $120, $150 a visit. But if an individual is seeing a physician, let's say once a month or twice a month, that's 12 to 24 visits a year, times, let's say, 25-year life expectancy, that can add up pretty quickly down the road. Catheters are very similar to that, not individually expensive, but when you consider them in the aggregate, can lend itself to be pretty significant dollars in the set aside. So again, look at what those items are. Think about where it is in the process for these big ticket items. If a trial is required, has it occurred yet? Did the individual fail a trial? Are there other requirements before they need to proceed with these types of procedures? What is the likelihood of proceeding with these procedures? Are there comorbid conditions that would prevent a procedure from pursuing? A high BMI, a need to cease smoking first, other types of comorbid conditions, a heart condition that might prohibit certain procedures from moving forward, things of that sort, and trying to get clarity around that to determine whether or not that actually impacts whether or not this a procedure or surgery will actually move forward. And of course, as mentioned previously, you want to try to obtain written confirmation from the treating physician to support why something is being excluded from the set aside itself. All right, so from there, we've talked about cost mitigation. The other item when we're thinking about Medicare set asides and closing files, closing or settling files in Arizona is thinking about whether or not a $0 MSA might be applicable. Now, if you're dealing with, well, let's start by saying that there's two types, right? And one is the medical zero, which is based off of the indication that there's no reasonable, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, the individual does not require any future medical treatment as it relates to a work injury, right? So that's essentially indicating that there's no more need for future medical, so there's no need for a Medicare set aside, and the set aside should be zero. So that's based off a medical basis. The other one's a legal zero, which is based off a denied claim. So Medicare would indicate or review cases where if it's a denied claim, there's no payment to medical or indemnity, and the claim is not yet settled, Medicare has approved $0 MSAs as a result of that. When you're looking at the new full and final rules, you might have a situation where there is no indication of future medical treatment, and you might be able to apply or ask for a medical zero as a result. The important aspect of that is making sure that you do get that medical record, it does come from the treating physician, and it clearly indicates that there's no expectation of future medical moving forward. If there's any type of qualifying language to that, sometimes the physician might throw in the language at this time, then it's going to be less likely that Medicare approves the zero as a result. Additionally, we started to see Medicare actually moving away from reviewing the medical zeros. They've indicated, or they kind of turned the submitters back to the language within the reference guide that indicates that there's no need to essentially set aside any dollars in those specific instances. So just be aware, there's a little bit of an inconsistent application of that, but understand that Medicare does carve out an exception for the need to set aside dollars in settlement based off of no need for medical treatment. And also, while Medicare has reviewed them in the past, they're not necessarily reviewing it with consistency in these days. And then, moving on to the non-submit discussion and the non-submit option, I think it's really interesting because, and appropriate, because when we talk about cost mitigation, when we talk about these different options to think about controlling costs in a set-aside, it's because Medicare has taken such an open view of including treatment in these MSAs, right? I think one of the main critiques from the industry is that, you can't prescribe oxycodone 80 milligrams, 4 times a day for 30 years. That's not medically appropriate, right? But Medicare is still going to do that because that's how they approach the allocations of medications in the MSA. So what the industry has recently done is to consider, hey, do we actually need to submit these MSAs to CMS for review and approval? And actually, Medicare has indicated numerous times, both in the policy memos as well as the consolidated information in the reference guide, that no, the answer is no, that there's no statutory or regulatory provision that actually requires you to submit an MSA to CMS for review and approval. It's a completely voluntary process, but they do indicate that if you do submit an MSA to CMS for review and approval, that the submitters and the parties essentially comply with the established review policies and procedures. So that's their way of saying you don't need to submit, but if you submit, you have to play by our rules, right? So so the industry looked at that and said, hey, like, why are we doing this, right? Well, the answer is that when parties submit an MSA to CMS for review and approval, you obtain the certainty from Medicare, if they issue an approval, that the amount that was provided or approved is sufficient to consider and protect Medicare's interests. And so long as it's properly utilized, expended, and Medicare has notice of that, then they're not going to step in and deny payment for Medicare-covered treatment, even though it's related to the underlying claim settlement. That's the advantage of submitting it to CMS. Now, the disadvantage, obviously, is that you are playing by those rules, right? You are playing by the rules where Medicare is going to try to include everything that they read in a medical record, that they're going to allocate for prescription medication at the current frequency and dosage without any consideration of the effect of it on the individual, or whether or not it's actually reasonable to continue it long term. So obviously Medicare can be over-inclusive. So the question is, when you look at a file, when you look at a settle form file, are you, and there's an indication for future medical treatment, are you going to submit or not submit, right? That's the question. So as a result of that, the industry's kind of developed this concept of evidence-based Medicare set-aside, right? And in the certain circumstances, Mark discussed them earlier, Medicare has a review threshold in place. There might be situations where it doesn't even fall within the review threshold, right? What if you're not dealing with a settlement that exceeds $25,000? Even if you submit it to Medicare, they're not going to review it, even though it involves a Medicare beneficiary, right? So there's instances where it doesn't even meet the review thresholds, and then other circumstances where, to obtain a fair and equitable settlement for the parties, it doesn't make sense to submit, right? And there's no legal requirement to. So as a result, one approach of kind of meeting in the middle is to still consider and protect Medicare's interests through an allocation of a future medical for future medical, but utilizing reasonable standards of based off of evidence-based medicine, right? So you're looking at what the what the treatment looks like, the status of the individual, what's reasonable anticipated treatment for that type of injury, and factoring in certain aspects that Medicare would not normally factor in when reviewing it as part of a submission, right? So in addition to this, the industry's also looked at how to obtain a little bit more certainty behind these evidence-based Medicare set-asides, even though you're not submitting it to CMS for review, by providing some post-settlement protections where if Medicare does consider that the amount is not appropriate, that the vendor that completed the set aside will actually step in and say, hey, we'll not only defend why the allocation is appropriate, but we'll also provide monetary protections if Medicare denies payment for some reason, or seeks recovery in some reason. Right? So when we look at evidence-based medicine MSAs, EV-MSAs, and we're not submitting it to CMS for review and approval, one of the things that I think you should keep in mind as well, and we encourage folks to keep in mind, is that one size doesn't necessarily fit all, right? And sometimes if you're trying to apply it programmatically, where you're saying, every case is going to utilize an EV-MSA and none of the cases are going to be submitted to CMS, you might be missing out on a situation where you can still get that certainty with CMS, right? And still have an MSA fall within a reasonable amount. And that's really where that cost mitigation comes in, that cost mitigation practice and consideration comes in to help contain those costs. In other cases, you might not want to submit every MSA to CMS. So that's why we really feel that, strategic approach probably makes the most sense. And, certainly we can assist in looking at the file, thinking about how, the different factors that are in play, utilizing, analytic data sets to help make the right decision making, things of that sort. So, and when you think about strategic submission, obviously you want to, design a program around that, thinking about the different factors. These are just some examples that I have up on the screen. I'm not going to go through them in a ton of detail, but think about the status of the injured individual, how that applies. What, I mentioned this previously, what the treatment status is. Are we looking at files that might have medications over a certain amount? Have medication or medical treatment stopped or slowed down? Are there high cost dollar items that need to be considered? And also think about maybe some of the legal or jurisdictional considerations, within Arizona that might essentially exclude the carrier from being responsible for a certain treatment, and think about how that might apply when thinking about utilizing EV-MSAs strategically. And then just kind of wrapping up on my end, talking about some of the takeaways, from soup to nuts, just from a high level, think about the status, as Mark had indicated. Are we dealing with somebody with an immediate interest with Medicare? Does the case meet those CMS review thresholds that Mark talked about? We want to think about, whether or not the parties are going to be submitting, if it does meet the CMS review thresholds, or how to deal with the ones that don't meet them. Think about whether an EV-MSA does apply. Think about whether or not the parties are interested in post-settlement protections. Have you thought about the cost mitigations that are in play? And then, of course, think about how MSA will be funded, leveraging an annuity or a structure amount to keep the cost down, and as well as whether or not it will be professionally administered. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over. That was a lot, but yeah, why don't you take us down the recovery path?
You got it, Sid. So, folks, Sid just concentrated on one part of the Medicare puzzle that you have to be cognizant of, which is the MSA, which is really about carving money out for the future, trying to keep that reasonable. As you can see, Sid's an expert in that area, lots of experience in that, okay? But remember, the other part of Medicare deals with making sure that Medicare is reimbursed if they paid for certain things. So now we're moving in another direction. And if you look at your Arizona law, that's one of the components in there that I believe the claimant has to sign some affidavit that they've taken into account all liens, including Medicare. So we got to also consider this, right? Okay. And there's different types of recovery claims. There's conditional payment recovery claims that relates to Medicare Part A and B. Now we have Part C Medicare Advantage recovery claims. And we could have D. Part D also, the prescription drug providers have recovery rights. They really have not been that active in pursuing them. So we're not going to, in the interest of time, we're not going to really talk too much about that today. So we want to concentrate on conditional payments for the Part A and B part of Medicare, and then I'll come in to show you how it changes when we talk about Part C. Now, this was exactly why before the opening I said, yeah, now also have to know, well, what program is my claimant on? Look, if they're on A, B, or C, it doesn't matter for set-aside. You got to do set-aside. When it comes to recovery claims, it matters for another reason, because you're going to see now that there's different systems in place to make sure either the government's reimbursed at Part A and B, or the Medicare Advantage plan's reimbursed at Part C. Sid, let's go forward And let's first talk about governmental traditional Medicare Part A and B, the governmental plan, the one plan in town. So the question then becomes, what type of rights does CMS have? They have very broad rights. They have very strong rights. They can go after the claimant. They can go after the insurance carrier. They can go after the claimant's lawyer, okay? And they could assess interest if the debt isn't paid in time. Delinquent debts could go off to the U.S. Department of Treasury, and then the insurer has to deal either with the direct recovery action from Treasury, or worse yet, an offset from Treasury, where they simply take money from a corporate tax return, for example, to recoup their lien payments, okay? And that's not a nice situation. CMS, the government, can also sue insurance carriers for double damages. They could do it. There's no question the government in Part A and B can sue the insurance carrier for double damages. Typically, what we see them doing more is passing it off to Treasury, right? It's a lot quicker, and either siphoning their money from an offset, or you having to deal with Treasury in a Treasury claim. Now, how they do this, okay, if you look at the nutshell, this is a brand new deck. I probably would have flipped these two boxes, okay? If you look underneath the nutshell, the bottom box talks about how CMS uses two contractors. All right, so if you think about what I'm saying on the screen is this: CMS has like all these super duper rights. They could go after both parties. Bad stuff could happen if you don't take care and reimburse their recovery conditional payment amount. It's called conditional payment because of the statute. It says if Medicare makes a payment for something that the comp carrier is responsible for, it's being paid on the condition they're going to be reimbursed, hence the term conditional payments. So the question then really for you and I when we handle these files is, how does it work? Or, and I put work in quotes. And to understand that, we have to understand that CMS, as this particular slide indicates, uses two contractors. There they are, the CRC, Commercial Repayment Center, and the BCRC, the Benefits Coordination and Recovery Center. So the question then becomes on the next slide, in workers' comp, when do we see which contractor and how does it work? Okay, so remember, CMS has these two contractors. And when the workers' comp carrier has something called ORM, this is a Section 111 term, but don't freak, okay? It's called ongoing responsibility for medical. It's essentially a situation where the comp carrier picks up a body part or an injury or condition and says, we'll be responsible for it. Well, in the 111 world, that's called ORM, okay? Ongoing responsibility for medical. So when the carrier has this ORM, look at the little arrow going over, CMS will use the CRC contractor, okay? And the CRC contractor, while the claim is ongoing, will come after the workers' compensation carrier. And they issue these notices called conditional payment notices, CPNs. And many of you have seen these. And they only give you 30 days to respond or object. And don't miss the deadline. It gets tricky if you start missing the deadline. And this is the CRC coming to you to say, look, we understand that you're responsible for the right elbow. We paid for the right elbow, and now we want to be reimbursed. And you could see this happening on a rolling basis as the claim progresses. Settlement doesn't matter at this point. ORM is all that matters. If there's ORM, here comes the CRC contractor. Now, when you settle the workers' compensation case, that is called the TPOC. That's the next circle. In the 111 world, it's the total payment obligation to the claimant. Really, all it is, folks, is a settlement, okay? So when we settle a workers' compensation case, CMS, in their wisdom, and that's in quotes, okay, in a growing trend, has been switching the contractor to the BCRC. Any remaining debt that's out there that wasn't addressed by the CRC and the workers' comp carrier before the settlement, we're seeing a trend where it's swept up and given to the BCRC, the other contractor. And as part of that, CMS is changing the debtor from the workers' comp carrier to the claimant. Now, this can create some issues as part of the settlement process, because if the carrier wants to retain the ability to deal with that conditional payment all the way to the end, to make sure it's taken care of, if and when CMS changes the contractor to BCRC and the debtor to the claimant, their ability to do that at workers' compensation stops unless they have the claimant execute an authorization allowing them to do that. Up until that point, the carrier doesn't need that when they're dealing with the CRC. So typically what Sid and I have talked to a lot with comp carriers is, as part of the workers' comp settlement now, if the carrier is interested in maintaining control to make sure that conditional payment is addressed and repaid, and I get it, okay, because you want to make sure it's done right and it's done. Just realize, as part of the settlement, it's probably a good practice to have the claimant sign this authorization. It's called a proof of representation. It's a horrible title, okay, because you don't technically represent the guy, okay? But as part of that settlement, you probably want him or her to sign that, because if CMS switches the contractor and switches the debtor, you already have the authorization ready, rather than having to chase down the claimant that you just paid money to, who maybe has no longer interest in dealing with you. Sid, any comments? Did I miss anything in that description?
No, it's a great point that you outlined. I think the thing to keep in mind is to just make sure, as part of this, that the parties understand that this can occur, right? And primarily it happens when you're dealing with either a fully denied or a partially denied claim, where the carrier debtor has already disputed an amount with the CRC and there's a remainder in some way. So the other thing is, in addition to getting the signed proof of representation form, is that how the parties clearly delineate who's going to be responsible should Medicare continue to pursue, for post-settlement, pursue for conditional payments post-settlement, and making sure that's clearly delineated, so there's no questions on it.
Thank you, Sid. So now, how does it change when we have a claimant down Medicare Advantage? So let's look at that. So I've kind of danced around and talked a little bit about Medicare Advantage plans. Look, they're private Medicare plans. Okay, it's not the government. People like these plans. They offer more benefits, better networks. They like the way they operate. They got all types of advertisements on the TV every 5 minutes. Sid and I joke about Joe Namath. That's what he's talking about, right? Okay. Talking about calling the hotline and getting yourself into one of these Medicare Advantage plans. He's bouncing off the walls about all this stuff that the government doesn't provide, like it needs it, like rides to medicals and meals and all this stuff. So this inspires people to say, yeah, man, I want one of these Medicare Advantage plans, these Part C Medicare plans. So now we got a problem, right? Because we got roughly 39% of the Medicare population now on a Medicare Advantage plan. And that figures about the same amount in Arizona, okay, right? And so the question is, do these folks have recovery rights? And the answer is yes. Underneath their own statutes, if you look to the right, they may bill or they may charge insurers or claimants for reimbursement. The big one is, in some jurisdictions, the courts have now also allowed these Medicare Advantage plans to sue insurance carriers for double damages. And in a couple of instances, they've actually won. And the courts have awarded double damages against the insurance carriers for not addressing the Medicare Advantage plans. Arizona has an interesting case a number of years ago, I won't go too deep into it, out of the Ninth Circuit, where the issue of whether the Medicare Advantage plans can sue an insurance company, a primary payer, for double damages didn't quite make its way to the ninth. Almost, okay? The Ninth Circuit dealt with another case about whether Medicare Advantage plans can sue survivors in a wrongful death liability claim, and they said no. But the Ninth and the Arizona courts have not yet addressed this double damage issue. But be careful, because the walls are closing in around the country. More and more courts are saying, yes, they can sue for double damages, including 2 district courts in California, okay? And regardless of that, remember, the Medicare Advantage plans are still going to have some form of recovery right underneath their own statutes and regs, right? So you have to have some plan in place to make sure that you're dealing with these potential Medicare Advantage lien claims. And Sid, I'm not sure what's on the next slide. The new deck. There it is. So look at Arizona's gray. So the gray states are the states that have not technically yet addressed whether these Medicare Advantage plans can sue for double damages. States in red and yellow, they have, and the courts have allowed the Medicare Advantage plans to sue for double damages. The red states are higher courts. Those are U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeal, yellow U.S. District Courts, right? So just because you're in a gray state doesn't mean you're scot-free, because remember, there's still the Medicare Advantage recovery statutes you got to deal with. It just means right now that your courts have not addressed whether they can also sue for double damages. Every year, Sid and I have to change this slide because every year they keep winning, and the country seems to keep closing in. The dominoes are falling with Medicare Advantage. Okay. Game plan. Got to have a way to identify whether the person's on Medicare Advantage or the governmental plan. Right now, there's not a centralized database to determine Medicare Advantage status. There will be by the end of the year through something called the PAID Act. I can get you my webinar and an article on that if you want. But right now, the only way you're going to know whether your claim is on a Medicare Advantage plan is to ask. Whatever your discovery rules allow in Arizona, I defer to that. Okay. That will change eventually, but we're not there. And then you got to have a policy. Who's going to address the lien? Just like Sid was talking about with the governmental lien. Who's going to be responsible? How's it going to be done? Who's paying it back? How are we going to memorialize this as part of our settlement language? Okay. So you got to worry about governmental liens. You got to worry potentially about Medicare Advantage plans. Okay. You may not have one in your file. You may have a lien from both the government and Medicare Advantage. How could that happen? That could happen because the beneficiaries once a year can change plans. So if you have a 5-year case, the person could have been in the government plan for the first 3 years and went to Aetna or Humana Medicare Advantage plan the last 2 years. So in those two instances, in that instance, you would have 2 potential lien claims, one from the government, actually 3, one from Aetna and one from Humana. Okay. So you have to somehow flag this down. This will become easier once the PAID Act becomes live. Okay, before we go to question answer, as we come up to time, real quick on the next slide, on the next one, we can help you with a lot of this stuff. We didn't talk about 111 today, but the $1,000 penalty there, if you worry about that, the penalties are about to go live soon. Okay, we don't know when exactly. Talk to us. We have some services that could help you. We have an audit product. I hate the name, but it sounds like we're trying to put somebody in jail. It's not that. We're going to help you with your program to see where you're weak and where you need to bone up. Okay. Recovery claims, conditional payment, Medicare Advantage, Part D prescription, if you get one of those, Treasury. We got the claim. Okay. The services. And we got practitioners who are skilled and do nothing all day but these type of claims. MSA. Sid talked about all these cost reductions, and it was dizzying, right? Well, it's really not that hard because our services are going to identify these opportunities for you and give you the recommendations you need to plug in to reduce these MSA amounts. Or if you're interested in non-submission, for instance, Sid's the guy, all right? He's helped develop the service on our end, and there's no one better in the country at it, okay? And then also, not for today's purposes, but in today's techie world, and people in my office will probably laugh that I'm handling this part, Sid, but we also have predictive analytic tools that could help you, score cases, etc., so you can get ahead of the curve, find the right resources to get a step ahead of keeping the costs down and ultimately settling it. Sid, before we go to Q&A, not sure if I missed anything there, but feel free to add some color.
No, I think you covered it really well. As Mark indicated, we have a full suite of services that can really be customized however you need and want. And we have a great team of folks that do only Medicare compliance, right? So you can hit us up with anything you need.
Okay, excellent. Mandy, I understand we have some questions. Can you ask our experts that?
Yes, we do. I have a question that came on. In the PAID Act, we will be required by law to do something like Section 111 reporting?
No. That's mixing apples and oranges, okay? So the PAID Act actually put a requirement on CMS. How about that? Okay, right? So the PAID Act will require CMS to expand its Section 111 query process. That's the process through the 111 where CMS identifies for the insurance carrier whether a person's a Medicare beneficiary. Currently, it just tells you whether or not he or she is a Medicare beneficiary, and that's it. It doesn't tell us whether it's government Medicare, Medicare Advantage, or prescription drugs. The PAID Act will change this at some point this year. CMS has to December of this year to change this. Underneath the PAID Act, it's CMS that's required as part of the query now, not only to tell the insurer whether the person's on Medicare, but if so, the type of Medicare, and if it's Part C or Part D, prescription drugs, they will then have to provide the insurer with the name and address of the plan. So the requirement is on CMS. Now, once the insurer gets that information, they now have the information that they're going to have to make a decision of whether they should then be spearheading the process to go to those plans to obtain the lien. The law doesn't say the insurer has to do that. The law puts the obligation on CMS to give the insurer the information. 111 is completely separate, okay? The only relation 111 has to this is CMS will have to feed us the information through the Section 111 query. So hopefully that clarifies that.
Thank you, Mark. Here's another one. What is the best starting point when considering going to the non-submit route?
I can take that since that was my section. Yeah, it really, when you look at it, I generally start with, does it even meet the CMS review thresholds, right? If it doesn't, then, you're going to, I think the non-submit makes a lot of sense, right? Outside of that, you probably want to think about, how it impacts your claims, what the risk tolerance is of the parties, and determining whether or not a non-submit is appropriate based off of injuries that are involved, the interest of the settlement amount, and I consider a couple of options of considering what might be triggers, the cost of medications, the types of treatment that might be allocated, is the individual represented, are there legal considerations that would exclude certain treatment from being included in a set aside? Things of that sort, I think, are good starting points to determine whether or not a non-submit is appropriate in a particular case.
Excellent. Well, that's all the time we have for questions, but I do want to thank our experts very much for joining us today and sharing their vast knowledge on this topic and all the changes that are happening there in Arizona. In addition to that, I'd like to remind all of you that your certificates will be arriving by email tomorrow, and you will be able to download those handouts until the end of this presentation. If you're unable to do so, please let Mandy know, and we will be happy to email those over to you so that you have a copy. And lastly, we have an event that's coming up on March 11th, which is the 1-year anniversary since the last Macro Pro and Friends. And later that day, the state of California had their shelter-in-place order. And so we're kind of commemorating that day and having a 5-hour webinar. All classes will be worth 1 CEU unit there in California. And I believe Arizona doesn't need them. So we certainly hope that you will join us for the great information that we have. Until the next Macro Pro and Friends, on behalf of myself and Mandy, thank you so much, Mandy, for helping to organize this. We would like to say bye and have a great day.
Thank you.
Guys.